Hello, welcome back to the series on the Dark Night of the Soul. In this video, I will be talking about suffering. This is a vast and deep subject, and it is something that we all as humans have a really difficult time dealing with. So this is a first part one video, and I will address this subject many different times, and purposely in a slow way because of how difficult it is for us to even look at. And that is the first thing that I want to talk about. So suffering is inevitable. It is part of being a human, part of being alive. So not even human, because animals suffer. Anything that is alive will experience suffering throughout our whole lives in various degrees. Buddha explains to us in the Four Noble Truths. One of the Four Noble Truths is suffering. We will suffer. And even though this is something that we all experience in various degrees throughout our whole life, it is something that we deny, and it is something that we have a hard time looking at. So, in the ways that we suffer, the various degrees, it can go from you suffering because you have a child that you love and you fear that they're going to die. You fear something could happen to them. This could be a partner as well, a friend. You have parents, you know they will die. So this is a form of suffering. There are all degrees of suffering. And even though you don't consciously think about this all the time, subconsciously you are affected by it. And you are affected by it as long as you do not look at it. And even then you will be affected by it. But again, there are varying degrees of things, of how you'll be affected by it, of the suffering. There are various degrees of the suffering that you have to feel. So when you come to understand suffering more on a deeper level, you can alleviate and ease some of your suffering. We can't avoid suffering, and many of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid suffering. So much to the degree that some people forget to enjoy and live their lives beyond this survival and avoidance of suffering. And it is true that we do want to avoid suffering. So if you are in a relationship with someone and you have not dealt with your childhood wounds, and you decide to go and cheat on your partner, and then your partner finds out and your relationship ends, this is unnecessary suffering that you could have avoided. So yes, you should make conscious decisions, conscious actions where you don't get involved in unnecessary suffering. This is true. But there is suffering that we cannot avoid. This is a part of life. Your parents' death, the death of any loved one, the suffering of sickness, of old age as you, not even old age, as you get into your late 30s, it is likely that you will start to experience physical pain on a regular basis. And this will be different for all of us. And also, like I keep saying, this degree will be different for people, but it will be there. So there is suffering that we can avoid by conscious decisions and wisdom. And there is suffering that is unavoidable. And this unavoidable suffering, or suffering that you do not choose, that happens to you, is the suffering that we need to change the belief that we have that this shouldn't be happening. Because this belief that this suffering shouldn't be happening, I shouldn't be experiencing this suffering, is a resistance to the suffering which is inevitable. So one way that we can begin to take on this challenge is to begin to understand and look at suffering as a noble truth, as something that happens to all beings that are alive. And to start removing some of the meaning, the pity that you have for yourself. And I want to be really careful with my words, because in no way am I saying that suffering is easy or something that we would choose. It is ugly. It is hard. It is so deep. Suffering is horrific, especially when you're talking about the higher levels on the spectrum of suffering. So you have the lower levels of suffering, like the fear that something could happen. That's a suffering. Or you have the suffering of experiencing a loved one being killed in front of you. Okay, so there are various degrees of suffering, and they are all painful. So I'm not taking away any of that. That is true. But the beginning step, because what happens is, I like to use, it came to me that I have a heater at my desk at work, and when it gets too hot, it shuts off. And our brains are wired so we can really only focus. If you've ever noticed and you pay attention when you are listening to someone talk about their own suffering, or when you are trying to think about, maybe your own death or your parents' death, some extreme suffering. After a few seconds, your brain does the same thing. It's a survival mechanism. It gets too much and it switches off. You'll notice that your brain, excuse my stomach, I'm on, this is my first day of alternate day fasting, different video. So yes, our brain can only concentrate for just a few seconds, if you'll notice. Listen to someone talking about suffering and notice that your brain keeps trying to switch off. And this is why it's so difficult for us to start to examine things like death, like our own death, which is inevitable, or our parents, maybe a partner, the death of these people. It's hard because our brains are actually working against us. They're trying to protect us. So what's happening is it's too much information, right? It's a lot. It's deep. So your brain will actually shut off, just like my heater does at work. But if we understand that this is something that we have to look at, that because it's unavoidable and because it happens to all living beings, it isn't something that you can build a bubble around yourself and avoid it. You will experience suffering. So it is on our benefit to get to know suffering, to understand suffering, and to remove some of the beliefs that we have about suffering that are causing us more suffering. Like I said at the beginning, the belief that this shouldn't be happening, or that it is some sort of punishment. Religion has soiled suffering in many ways, many spiritual communities as well, where they lead you to believe that if you are suffering, then you have caused this suffering yourself, or that you have aligned yourself to this suffering, when in fact suffering is one with being alive. So these are things that we want to start to look at, and we want to start accepting as truth. And the meaning that we give suffering, like I mentioned before, is also a contributor. So I'm on a fast today. Let's use this as an example. So I'm not going to eat today. I'm going to do every other day eating. And if I didn't have the knowledge that this is so beneficial to my health, and that I'm hoping to trigger autophagy, where the old and weak cells are eaten by the new cells and new, healthier cells are created, and the plaques in our brains can be cleared out, in our heart. We are allowing our bodies to heal itself without the constant feeding. But I can look at it this way, or I could look at it as I am going without. I am lacking today. I am suffering today. So the ways in which we look at things can be changed. They aren't fixed. And when we broaden our view, we broaden our knowledge on subjects, we can then change our perspective. So this is the beginning. This is the first stage of looking at suffering. And it is a good idea, specifically, to start to acknowledge your own death. Because many of our fears that we have, if you trace them back and back and back and back, they all lead to death. So even if you want to use I'm a mother, so a lot of times I think of my children, and I know a lot of mothers can relate to this. So if you're thinking and you have the fear that something's going to happen to my child, and then I will die as well, right? This is a common emotion that mothers feel, parents even. I don't want to exclude fathers from this. So if your child were to die, you, in a way, you would die as well. And so this is a fear of yours, that you cannot live. You would not be able to face the world under these conditions. So it isn't just the fear that something's going to happen to your child. It's deeper, right? It's that then you will not be able to live. This is not a world you would want to live in. So it's important, because everything, all of our fears go back to this fear of death, that we start to examine our own inevitable death. But if you understand that we are eternal beings, this will help. This is really deep. I'm not going to be able to cover this all in one video. But the first time that death was brought to my attention was when Ram Dass was speaking, and he was talking about how he was training with Buddhists. I don't remember because there's Tibetan Buddhists and Australian, and the traditions and practices vary. So I don't recall which sect this was in Buddhism, but where he was training the Buddhists, when they died, there was this garden, this small, fenced-in garden area where they would throw the bodies of the Buddhists that had died, the monks that had died. And it was practice at night for the Buddhists to go and watch the bodies, to become familiar with death. There was no part of death that they were not to become familiar with. And I remember hearing this, and he was describing some of the processes of the decaying body, and I remember thinking, whoa, that's a lot. And it really just exploded my brain with an interest about death, and about our denial of death, and about how we choose to not look at it. It's too much for us to handle, although it's inevitable. So we don't want to wait until it's happening to us, where we have this limited time to look at it, and examine our lives. So I think I'm going to end that here on this video and continue this talk about suffering and about death. And I want to leave you with encouraging you to start examining suffering and accepting in your life. The first thing is just accepting that in your life you will experience suffering, various degrees of suffering. And that suffering allows us to connect to others, because if you don't experience suffering, you will not be able to have any compassion for others that are going through that same thing. So, for example, in a past life, so us old souls, we have experienced so much suffering. We have seen and experienced and even done suffering. So much. This is why our hearts are so full. We can hold the suffering of the world, because we can understand it. So we will talk about in another video some of the reasons why this is an inevitable process for humans, and why how we can change our viewpoint on suffering in general, and in death in general as well. So this is deep. This is a really deep subject, and it's really real. It's a real subject. It's something that none of us can avoid. So let's start to accept that suffering is not something that is a punishment. It isn't something that you've done wrong. It is a byproduct of being alive, and that there are ways that we can begin to look at suffering instead of denying it, and to examine death, and to change some of our thinking towards it. So I will connect with you again soon. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and follow these videos on suffering, and begin to examine your own death now, as early as you can. We never want to wait. But I will connect with you soon. I love you so much. I hope you are doing well tonight, today, in your dark night of the soul. You're going to make it. Find balance. And I love you. I will connect with you soon. Thank you.